Good afternoon and welcome to today's Big Issues in Biodiversity webinar. Today we'll be looking at integrating business and biodiversity. When can business contribute to a nature positive future? And we're privileged to be joined by Tom White from the Nature Positive Hub at Oxford University and Biodiversity Consultancy. Today I'll introduce Tom a little later. My name's Owen Nevin. I'm the Chief Executive here at WABSI, the West Australian Biodiversity Science Institute. In opening today's webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're joining you from, and from the lands that we have the privilege to work on here in Western Australia. I'm joining you from Perth today on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and really express our deep respect for the 60,000 plus years of careful care and custodianship of this land, of the traditional owners, and express the privilege it is to join in that journey of understanding and managing this land hand in hand with traditional owners. WABSI, for those who aren't familiar with us, is a joint venture based here in Western Australia, linking together the universities, 4 government departments, CSIRO, our Commonwealth Science and Research Organisation, with the West Australian Museum. So bringing together the research capacity, the management and regulatory capacity within government for environment here in the state. We sit at the interface between research, government, industry, community, and really our purpose is to facilitate that collaboration to identify and address large strategic challenges in biodiversity for a sustainable future, and we work as that trusted hub between those different sectors. We take an end user led approach, so it's talking to the users of environmental information and knowledge to understand what their needs are, then work through with our research community to understand how those knowledge gaps could be closed, and then back with those stakeholders to implement research that closes knowledge gaps and helps them make better decisions, manage the environment better, and hopefully lift the standards for all of us. That takes shape in the form of research prioritizations and topic-specific reports that we generate, and these are all made available through the WABSI website. So, as I mentioned at the start, today's guest speaker, Tom White, is a research fellow at Oxford University and principal consultant at the Biodiversity Consultancy, and appreciate Tom joining us today from the UK to share some of the work that he's been involved with, and I will stop sharing my screen and hand you over to Tom. Before doing that, I will say, if you have questions along the way, drop them into the chat function, and at the end of the discussion I'll curate those and bring those together into hopefully a conversation that answers your questions with Tom at the end. So Tom, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thanks very much, Owen, and thanks everyone for joining. It's really nice to be able to speak to you and share with you, and I hope we can have a good discussion at the end. I'll just share my screen quickly. Can I just check, Owen, that you can see the presentation okay?
Yes, got that.
Great. So thanks everyone. Yeah, as Owen said, I'm a research fellow at the University of Oxford in the Nature Positive Hub team. And at the Nature Positive Hub, there's a group of us who work on the sort of interaction between business, finance, the economy, and nature, and the strategies that different actors within the economy can deploy to try and aid deliver in the delivery of nature recovery. I'm also a senior principal consultant at the Biodiversity Consultancy, where we work with businesses directly to try and help them understand their impacts on nature and develop strategies to mitigate those impacts and contribute to biodiversity objectives. And some of the research I'll be presenting today is joint research between the Nature Positive Hub and the Biodiversity Consultancy. So I wanted to start by going to a landscape I know really well. So this is a salt marsh on the east coast of the United Kingdom. This is an area that's, although it sort of in some ways doesn't look particularly special, it's actually quite important for biodiversity in the UK. It's got it's really important for some bird species such as the marsh harrier, little terns, godwits in some months of the year. It's got plants that are only found at this site and another site in the UK. And it's about as protected as you can get in the United Kingdom. So this is a triple SI, a site of special scientific interest, and a national nature reserve. So it's quite an important area for conservation in the UK. But the wider landscape around that reserve, and apologies, it's a bit blurry, this image, but this is a map for where I grew up. This is Hamford Water National Nature Reserve. Around it, you can see the landscape is mainly agricultural. It looks more like that image on the top left. This is an area important for the production of wheat, of oilseed crops, of potatoes, for example. And it's actually generally quite a degraded landscape if you're looking at it from a purely nature conservation lens. It's also an area that has had some offshore wind development, expansion of port infrastructure, and a lot of people live here. There's lots of housing. And I often think to myself, what does nature recovery look like in the landscape that I grew up in? And it will involve thinking about how we engage these different actors in the conservation process, how we engage these businesses, we mitigate those impacts, how we navigate these tricky trade-offs between environmental goals on one hand, but also the need for food production, the need for some of this industry to develop, for example. And so nature recovery here really depends on integrating these business actors into our discussions and our decision making. And I think that's actually the case more generally when we're thinking about global biodiversity goals. And so what I wanted to start with today is to talk about, firstly, what do we mean by nature positive? And what does that mean for an individual business or an organization? Then giving a bit of an overview of some of the research that's going on at the Nature Positive Hub in Oxford and trying to link that to the different changes that might be needed for a business to contribute to a nature positive future. And then if we've got time, I'll do a bit of a deep dive into one of our projects at the moment, looking at corporate targets for nature. So I won't spend too long on this. I'm sure many of you are aware of this already. Biodiversity is not generally in a very good state globally. This is the Biodiversity Intactness Index produced by the Natural History Museum, showing the change in the intactness of biodiversity measured as the composition of species that occur there, modeled composition of species changes. Anything in orange or yellow here has been quite severely degraded from its reference state. And you can see that many areas of the world, including some areas of the world that are quite important for global biodiversity, are being quite severely degraded. This is another example from the WWF Living Planet plot, an average reduction in the abundance of monitored species of 73% between 1970 and 2020. These are quite shocking statistics, and that's led to this global push, which was realized in that global biodiversity framework a few years ago, to try and halt and reverse the decline of biodiversity. And nature positive is synonymous with that global goal. It's a global societal goal to halt and reverse nature loss, so there is more nature on our planet in the future than there is today. And this term has got a lot of traction in various communities, used by NGOs, used by businesses. This has led to lots of initiatives popping up, guidance around how businesses can, what it means for businesses. The Nature Positive Initiative, this fantastic initiative trying to get alignment around terms and metrics for measuring outcomes, and also warnings published in the academic literature that we must use this term properly. We mustn't dilute the term, so that if we're using the term nature positive, it means that that organizations are actually contributing to that global goal. Achieving this will be quite a challenge, and that's sort of compounded by the fact that we're not in a great situation in terms of funding either. So this is a report from the United Nations Environment Programme, the State of Finance for Nature report. They showed that if we want to meet this global goal, annual funding really needs to triple by 2050 to meet our nature goals. And this will require an increased proportion coming from the private sector, recognizing that often the public sector finances are squeezed and there's lots of different priorities that need to be placed on those budgets. But actually the situation isn't quite as simple as that, because we also need to consider the negative financial flows that are impacting nature in a negative way, coming largely from the private sector. And so if we want to think about how to achieve that global nature recovery, we need not just to increase the amount of money going to positive conservation action, but also thinking about how we mitigate and reduce the money going to those negative flows for nature. And this is going to require engaging the private sector. This is a reverse. It's going to take transformative action to get from that grey line to that green line. This is a modified graph from that paper by Leclerc et al. A few years ago, where they modeled what it would take to get to that green line of bending the curve. And they showed that it's not just increased conservation efforts, but it is that changes in the way we produce and consume goods, changes more broadly in the economy that is going to be needed to get us to that green line. And there's a recognition in the global goals that that is going to require engagement with businesses. So in the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Target 15 is specifically targeted, looks at how businesses can engage with this. It asks countries to take actions to try and get businesses to regularly monitor, assess, transparently disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity, including not just their direct operations, but also their supply and value chains, their investment portfolios. And also importantly, to take action once that impact is understood to reduce negative impacts and increase positive impacts, trying to get business action to align with these global biodiversity goals. Now, I just wanted to go through what we think that might mean from a business, and it's actually quite an ambitious target to try and align your operations with. So what do we think it means for a business to contribute to those global nature goals? Well, firstly, we think we need to have comprehensive strategies. So there needs to be smart targets in line with all covering all material elements of biodiversity impacted by the organization, and in line with the mitigation hierarchy, taking steps to avoid, minimize, restore, and if needed, compensate for residual biodiversity impacts. Those strategies need to be underpinned by clear evidence, including a strong theory of change and how actions will lead to positive outcomes for nature. They need to be aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework, but also with emerging frameworks like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and the Science-Based Target Network, for example. Importantly, they need to be ambitious, much more ambitious than we see at the moment in terms of corporate and organizational biodiversity strategies. They need to deliver absolute gains for biodiversity against a static baseline, and ideally reducing material footprints in some cases too. It shouldn't really need to be said, but it does in some cases. These strategies and plans need to be effectively implemented with proper monitoring and disclosure to be able to hold those strategies and those organizations to account. This is a really important one, I think, and we need to think about extending the accountability of biodiversity and nature strategies deployed by organizations targeting not just direct project site impacts, but impacts across the value chain, thinking about indirect impacts as well, and also how these organizations can contribute to sector-wide efforts or landscape scale efforts that drive more systemic change for biodiversity. These strategies need to be integrated and just, so they need to think about how they match up with other environmental strategies, strategies for climate, for example, and promote synergies with other climate, environmental and social goals and minimize trade-offs. And then importantly, then that needs to be mainstreamed across organizations. It's not just the work of sustainability teams, it needs to be throughout the business, senior management, procurement, for example, that the teams that make the decisions that can have cause outcomes that have large effects on nature. So this is quite an ambitious set of principles here, and achieving this is really full of uncertainty. There are many different pathways, many different actions that a business could take to try and engage with this global goal of nature recovery. And so that's what our research at the Nature Positive Hub is trying to do, trying to tackle several points in that process, in those pathways that can help guide effective and practical organization action by organizations to contribute to nature recovery. So what I wanted to do now is just to give you a flavor of some of the projects that we're currently working on that go through, that try to guide this action. And to do that, I'll introduce a nature positive model that we developed a couple of years ago, and then try and insert our research into the different stages of that model. So I want to start with the actions that can be taken by individual businesses. And some of you may recognize these words here. This is the ACT-D framework. So businesses can first assess their impacts and their dependencies on nature, try to understand how they interact with nature, what their negative impacts, what their positive impacts and their dependencies might be. After understanding those impacts, there's then a need for an organization to commit to set targets on how they're going to align with that nature positive goal. There are questions at both those stages around how we do actually assess impacts, particularly, for example, through complex value chains, through investments, where research is really needed to help understand those interactions with nature, particularly for some sectors. There are questions around setting targets, around how ambitious the targets need to be in different sectors to actually align with that nature positive goal. Once we understand what those targets are in the strategy design, we then need to design actions that can actually effectively avoid, reduce, restore, and help transform the system. And there are questions there where research is needed, we think, on how effective those different actions can be, how feasible they are in different sectors, how cost effective they might be. This is really important data needed to guide efficient strategy design. And then lastly, once those strategies are being undertaken and implemented, there needs to be disclosure of what those strategies are and the outcomes, which can then feed back into that assessment of impacts. So to give some examples of projects that we're working on here, this was a project done a few years ago now by Joe Ball in the top left there, where he led an analysis of the biodiversity impacts of the University of Oxford. And this wasn't just thinking about the on-site impacts that might occur from the university, but thinking about the impacts that occur through the university's services, through its procurement of different products. And what I want you to take away from this is that from this analysis, the very large amount of impacts in the blue here were from the resource uses, the things needed for the university to function, but upstream in their supply chains. And these can be difficult to mitigate because it's associated with the activities that are needed for the university's main activity of research. And so addressing those upstream impacts and understanding them is really important here. This approach used a methodology called life cycle assessment, which tries to grapple with the complexity of these supply chains and these global value chains. And so we've also done some research here trying to really understand the uncertainties in this process and what those methodologies can actually tell a business. To give a brief overview of what these methods are doing, they take information on a big multinational company on the left. They gather information on the company activities. So that might be the amount of travel, the amount of food purchased, the built environment, the land use, the amount of resources used for research in the case of Oxford University. It then uses life cycle inventory data sets to try and understand the activities and processes associated with the entire life cycle of those different products and services. It then converts those into measures of environmental impacts. So, for example, for the different types of food purchases through the entire life cycle of those food products, how much CO2 emissions, how much land was used in the production of those food products, how much water was used, etc. And you can see these broadly match up with some of the pressures to biodiversity loss that we know are driving the loss of biodiversity around the world. Those environmental impacts are then more, estimated using life cycle impact assessment methods and converted into an estimate of their biodiversity impacts. And that uses underlying data sets that have tested the relationship between changing in those environmental impacts. So how much does changing 1 meter squared or 1 hectare of land to a different land use impact biodiversity in different regions of the world? So there's underlying data sets that these models are based on. But what they're modeling here is incredibly complicated, and as you might have thought, this is introducing a lot of assumptions into these methods. So what we've tried to do is develop some business guidance here on how these tools can be best used. These tools are incredibly powerful for understanding the complexity and of biodiversity impacts within complicated supply chains. And there are inevitable uncertainties associated with doing that. So what we've tried to outline here is what some of those uncertainties are and how these tools can be best used as part of biodiversity strategy design. We think they're best for businesses to use, particularly for early stage risk screening, for tracking progress over time as you start to take actions to reduce and to reduce and address impacts. And for prioritizing where more detail might be needed. If a particular ingredient, if a particular process is coming up as really high impact, that might be where you need more data and need to take more specific action to address those impacts. And importantly, using these approaches as part of a basket of metrics approach tailored to the most significant business and biodiversity risks. If anyone's interested, this QR code in the top right of the screen will take you to that briefing document. This work was co-led by Talitha Bromwich there on the screen. And so once you have an understanding of those impacts, you then need to try and think about what are the types of strategies that organizations can deploy. And this is something we're also doing some work on. So going back to that paper on the University of Oxford's footprint, this was again led by Joe Ball. Joe investigated some of the options of the types of strategies that could be taken by the university, thinking about strategies that might be heavy in avoidance measures, stopping the sale of meat, use of paper, implementing zero waste policy, require overseas remote working, etc., to reduce travel, or an offset heavy policy where some of those avoidance activities aren't really taken and we invest in purchasing biodiversity offsets. These strategies are they'll differ in their effectiveness and their feasibility, and something that the university is now working on is what does the strategy look like to address the impacts that have been identified in this study. You also need to think about the trade-offs that might emerge between different environmental goals. And this is a study led by Charlotte Maddinson here, where she worked with Wadham College. So Wadham is a college, an old college in the University of Oxford, where they'd implemented a really ambitious net zero strategy to try and reduce their annual carbon emissions and retrofit some of these old buildings, which, as you might imagine, are quite inefficient to heat. So let me just take you through what Charlotte did here. She wanted to investigate how these actions to reduce carbon emissions might also impact biodiversity, and she used those life cycle assessment methodologies that I was just talking about there. In the dashed line in the top left, in the yellow in the top left, you can see that is how carbon emissions, if the college did nothing to address its carbon emissions, would change over time. And that a slight decrease recognizes the change in the way the UK produces electricity over time. In the paler line, you can see in the yellow line going down at the bottom, you can see the reductions in annual carbon emissions associated with the actions that they are taking to reduce their carbon emissions. So that might be retrofitting buildings, installing more efficient fridges and ovens, etc. And you can see that through their strategy, they get quite a long way to reducing those annual emissions by 2035. The red or darker line shows what if we also model the embodied carbon associated with those impacts. So you can imagine that buying a new fridge or an oven includes carbon emissions associated with its manufacturing. And so if we include those, then you can see there's a slightly different trend. But what Charlotte also did, she said, well, how far does this get if we also model the biodiversity impacts of those actions? And she showed that because climate change is a key driver of biodiversity loss, reducing those carbon emissions does also reduce the predicted biodiversity impacts from the company's activity. And you can see that in the bottom right there. But it doesn't get you all the way. And also, we weren't able to get at some of the things that might be key biodiversity impacts from the college, particularly their land holdings and the impacts of some of their investments. So it gets you some of the way. There is some synergy here, but there's a lot more action that the college could continue to do. So thinking about those trade-offs and synergies and strategies is really important. And then lastly on this section, thinking about the feasibility and the costs of different actions is also a really important topic that we try to get at in some of our research. This is a paper that I led a couple of years ago, working with a charity called BirdLife International, and thinking about the actions that energy companies could take to mitigate the number of collisions that high-powered transmission lines have in some areas of the world where they collide with bird species that are particularly at risk of colliding with this infrastructure. On the left-hand side graph, you can see the estimated number of collisions per year in a scenario where we modeled the impacts of a potential transmission line development on these at-risk bird species. And then in the orange, blue, and green lines, you can see how that might decrease if we implemented strategies to put bird flight diverters, the little sort of flaps you sometimes see on power lines, if you rerouted the power line around higher risk areas, or if you put the line underground. You can see that putting the line underground was by far the most effective way, putting sections of that line underground was the most effective way of reducing those number of collisions. But then on the right-hand side graph, you can see the costs associated with those different actions. And that paints a very different picture of what the most efficient and feasible measure might be. So understanding costs alongside effectiveness is a really important thing to try and guide efficient strategy design. In this paper, we went further and looked at the cost effectiveness of these different measures and tried to model how that might change over time. Okay, so that was all about the actions that individual businesses might be able to take. But then there's what we're terming here strategic options. There are broader questions around the types of strategies that different organizations and sectors might need to take to help contribute to that nature positive future. When is it okay, for example, for there to be small tweaks in business models to transform, to take actions to make things more efficient, to minimize impacts? And when might more transformative changes be required, shifts away from entire business models, for example? And the answer to that question will inevitably differ by sector and by the values that we place on different business activities. There are questions around when sectoral or regional collaborations are going to be necessary to delivering change, or when change can be delivered by an individual business on its own. There are questions around how high offsetting can a strategy be, and how much do we need avoidance in the first place? how and where can offsets be successfully implemented by businesses is a real question, because there's been questions around how limited evidence often on the success of those types of actions. So there's these more broader questions that need that need research, that need us to understand the strategies that these broader sectors can take to guide effective action. Beyond that, there's also what we're terming here systemic drivers of change. These are the different levers that can be pulled by other actors that might influence the actions taken by both leading businesses pushing the way in this regard, but also lagging businesses that are perhaps more reluctant to take changes. These are changes to financial markets. What mechanisms can promote the financing of conservation, of effective conservation actions? There are societal pressures. So how do different pressures from society drive the risks that companies and the subsequent action that they are trying to take? And also governance and regulation. What are the most effective types of actions and structures that governments can put in place that guide action, effective action by businesses? There is a real importance here in guiding what those levers are. And I think this is something that's often under-addressed in research. To give an example of something that our team are doing in this space, we do a lot of work on nature credit markets. So nature credit markets are being increasingly promoted as a solution for upscaling finance and nature, and particularly for engaging the private sector, for funneling private sector money into conservation goals. And that might address some of that financing gap that I talked about at the start of the webinar, and deliver, if done effectively, deliver environmental outcomes in line with global biodiversity goals. But nature markets have existed for many years in many countries, including in Australia, and what global reviews have seen is that although there are examples of project successes, many of those programs have not delivered on their environmental outcomes. And so work led by Sophus Suomgassen in our team has been thinking, what can we learn from this experience? What can we gather the challenges and the opportunities from these different markets and come up with some rules for the market design? And that's what Sophus has been trying to do in his recent paper, where he gathered researchers who had worked on the evaluations of different market-based mechanisms around the world, and come up with some golden rules for nature market design. And to go quickly over these, I'll show you a QR code if anyone's interested in the full paper in a minute. But firstly, does the thing that the market is measuring correlate with the outcome that is desired? And that has often not been done the case, where simple measurements have been used that haven't correlated properly with the outcome, the biodiversity outcome that is the objective of the market. Often markets have proven to take actions that lead to outcomes that are less additional than they would have hoped or they had stated. And so what this paper says is to shift the way we think about this, to assume non-additionality unless proven otherwise. So have a high burden of proof associated with the additionality of actions taken in these markets, to try and be more sure that they are leading to the outcomes we want, environmental outcomes we want. Sometimes these actions taken in these markets have led to displaced negative impacts occurring elsewhere, and that's what we call leakage. So having strategies in place to assess and manage leakage is really important in these markets, as well as having approaches to ensure that we can have independent verification, having the data available that can allow these markets to look at how effective these markets are, and also processes in place for long-term compliance and enforcement. So if things have gone wrong, there are the processes in place that can deal with that non-compliance. So if anyone's interested in this paper, it's coming out in a few weeks, I imagine. But this is the preprint available online, again, led by Sophus, these 5 golden rules for scientifically credible nature markets. And this tries again to get at those driving processes. How can we create systems that can drive more effective action by businesses to engage with nature recovery? And one of those is by if we can create effective nature markets that can funnel finance into those outcomes. Okay, so that was on the left-hand side of the figure, thinking about those driving forces. And then going to the right-hand side, we also need to think about how do we make sure that action by those individual businesses, by wider sectors, by governments, by financial actors is actually delivering the outcomes that we want. So how do we make sure that this is all causing positive impacts on biodiversity to be increased and negative impacts to be reduced in a way that adds up to these nature positive contributions that then feed back into that biodiversity framework? And that's something, again, that we're interested in our team. And to give a bit of an overview of this, this was some work not led by us, led by UNEP WCMC in Cambridge in the UK, where they assessed how many metrics for biodiversity are there out there. And they identified, I think it was over 400 different metrics in the literature that measured a huge variety of different things. And that's sort of understandable given the complexity of biodiversity, but it creates a really confusing landscape for businesses trying to engage with what to measure and when. You can see based on their review that there were many metrics that measured the state of nature itself, many that measured the pressures to nature, many that measured responses, the actions that different actors are taking to reduce those pressures or improve the state of biodiversity, and very few metrics that looked at the benefits, the services provided by nature for the economy, for society. And on the right, you can see that many of those metrics focused on ecosystems, many focused on species, but very few looked at genetic diversity, which we know is an important component of biodiversity. And so to try and tackle that complexity, this is a really great initiative. The Nature Positive Initiative are trying to create guidance in this space around what appropriate definitions are for nature positive, and particularly what is a subset of metrics that we can use for businesses to engage and contribute effectively to the nature positive, to measuring their outcomes in line with the nature positive future. This is a really impressive initiative where they are at the moment piloting those metrics in terrestrial, in freshwater, and in marine ecosystems. And then some of our research also tries to get at this, to think about these types of metrics. This is some work led by Nat Duffus, where she looked at how well a metric based on habitat condition and extent and the extent, condition, and distinctiveness of habitats that's used commonly in the UK as part of our biodiversity net gain offsetting scheme was capturing different types of biodiversity. And so she went out to the field. She looked at how those different sites on the x-axis here were measured in terms of that habitat-based condition metric, and then also in those same sites measured mean ground invertebrate abundance. And what she showed is that there was actually very little correlation between what the metric showed in terms of habitat condition and this specific component of biodiversity, in this case invertebrate abundance, recognizing here that this is an important type of taxa. And so if we wanted we need to be careful if we're using those metrics in a way that doesn't get at this nuance. So if we're really concerned about invertebrate abundance, then that habitat distinctiveness and condition score is probably not an appropriate metric, and we might need to supplement it with metrics that account for invertebrate biodiversity. Okay, so there are various pathways that are possible for businesses to contribute to this nature positive future, but that's going to differ by sector, by ecological and political contexts. And there are key uncertainties here, and the levers that need to be pulled at both the level of individual businesses, sectors, and those driving actions, where we think research is really needed to collaborative research between industry and academia to guide, and government as well, to guide that effective action and the strategies that might be needed. So thanks very much. I'm just going to ask Owen a question here. So Owen, this is to go into this deep dive will take me probably another five minutes.
I think we can definitely indulge the deep dive and look at those corporate targets over the next 5 minutes or so.
Okay, Great, thank you. So yeah, thanks everyone. That was giving an overview of that sort of the actions that might be required across that nature positive spectrum of business, sectoral, and actions by wider economic actors to guide that business action. I want to give a deep dive here into a particular project that we're working on corporate target setting. So this builds on some work that was done in 2019 that outlined that in some sectors there are a few companies in some sectors that have high impacts on nature. There are a few companies that in some way have influence over or control a very large proportion of those sectors. And they termed those keystone actors, where if you could influence those small number of companies, you could actually change the way that a large proportion of those sectors work. And they could have both substantial negative impacts on the biosphere or positive impacts if they take positive action. And so you can see here in the top left, for example, there are 10 companies in the paper and board sectors that in some way influence 25% of that entire sector. And they showed that some of these sectors were highly consolidated. So what we did in this project, led by Isabel Hawkins in the top left there, or what targets are these actors, these keystone actors in these different sectors, making with regards to biodiversity conservation? Realizing these ambitious targets are a vital part of corporate strategy design for nature positive contributions. And so Isabel updated that analysis on that previous page, tried to identify the levels of consolidation in different sectors, and then identified the biodiversity targets that those organizations were setting. She went through their online available reports, identified the targets they were making, and then scored those targets as to whether they were smart targets. Basically, did they have specific environmental components? Were they quantitative? Were they time-bound? Were they measurable, etc.? And there's some examples of what we considered a good target, a smart target, or a more vague target. So some companies might have said things like, we want to minimize impacts on biodiversity, which doesn't tell you very much about the specific actions and objectives they're trying to meet. And then this is an overview of that analysis. So you can see that, again, in the outer ring, there were a small number of companies in these high impact sectors for biodiversity that in some way had influence over a very large percentage of those different sectors. And so again, taking the example in the top left there are 10 companies in the gold sector that influence 29% of the activity in that sector through some sort of measure of the amount of economic activity occurring. And what we've added to this now in the middle is the percentage of these different organizations that made commitments. And so 89% of them had some sort of report available online that allowed us to assess whether they had environmental commitments. 87% of them mentioned biodiversity in those reports. 79% of them made some sort of level of commitment, and we were quite generous about what we termed a commitment here, which I think is a positive thing. It shows that biodiversity is rising on the agenda of these companies and is being, in some way, commitments are being made as part of environmental strategies. But only 13% of them gave commitments that met all of those different criteria that I just showed. So only 13% of them gave commitments that allowed us to really hold those, to allow the company to assess progress in a quantitative way, but also to be held accountable for those targets. That really differed by the type of sector. So some sectors had much more robust commitments, things like soybean, cocoa, palm oil, salmon. And then at the bottom, you can see some sectors that made less robust commitments, the cement, animal farmer, and seeds industry, for example. And in the paper, we explore some of the potential reasons for that. So to end, why might we be seeing these trends? We try to discuss this a little bit in the paper. Biodiversity is obviously rising on the agenda. A lot of companies are mentioning biodiversity in their reports. But why aren't we seeing these more specific targets being put in place? Well, it might be there's limited guidance and confusion in this space about what to do, and I think that is definitely true to some extent. Thinking about what an appropriate target actually is. And then linked to that also, there are risks associated with potentially making bold commitments that might not be met. companies worried about being seen as greenwashing, sometimes they may well be doing greenwashing by making these less bold commitments on purpose. But it also might be green hushing, where more ambitious activity is taken, but they're not talking about it potentially. There may also be a reason here that there's just limited willpower and capacity to engage with the biodiversity issue on a more robust way. In the paper, we make a number of recommendations around what more clear, specific, and transparent targets may be to allow these targets to be assessed in terms of their progress, but also to be held to account, and what standardization might be needed here, and the role of different types of actors, academia, businesses, consultancies, and NGOs in helping provide those more practical approaches for corporate target setting. So thank you very much, everyone. Here's a link to the paper that showed that model of an H positive trajectory for businesses. And if anyone's really interested, please do feel free to reach out to myself in the email below, and that was a joint paper between myself and Talitha. So yeah, thank you very much, and happy to now have a bit of a discussion and answer questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. That was a really good journey through the global context, and then yeah, I think it was really valuable to take that dive down into the specifics of target setting, and I think that is one of the challenges that many corporations face is the intent to set targets, but then the quantification of those targets, and that work that you've flagged with WCMC, looking at the metrics, where there's a huge diversity of metrics, and across the middle of that figure, there's that series of 3 zeros where, you know, there are no metrics that hit, you know, all of the various bubbles in that Venn diagram, and so as a corporate, it's really hard to pick a metric to then set a target and then to report against that target. From your perspective, having worked through that paper, and that paper having been an update of some previous work, do you think there are improvements in the pipeline, or is this a you know, conundrum that persists?
Thanks, Owen. I think yes, definitely. So there's a overwhelming complexity of biodiversity metrics out there. It's almost impossible to keep up with the changes in that space, but that's partly because those metrics are measuring different things. And so the first thing that's needed, and I think there's a lot of progress here, is some sort of standardization, some ways of understanding where different metrics might be most useful for different businesses. And so that's where I think the work of things like the Nature Positive Initiative is really great, because you can have this standardization of what are the most important things we need to measure that allow us to track progress over time and get a really good idea of how our organization is impacting the state of nature. But it also needs to be seen as part of this, what we term basket of metrics approach, where you have metrics that measure the most key actions that your organization is taking, the key pressures that your organization has on biodiversity. And so that might mean that if you're operating in a particular part of the world where there's a particular species that you might be impacting, then you need a metric that targets that taxa or that type of species. And so although there is this overwhelming, it seems like overwhelming complexity, I think focusing down on the really key impact pathways that your organization has can allow you to get a sort of a smaller basket of things to measure that tackle the highest business and biodiversity risks for your organization.
Thanks. A follow-on from that in terms of just trying to rephrase a question here from the chat, but in one of your figures, you've got that sort of left to right, and you had the levers, the external drivers that were over on the left, and a question around is there any evidence of which are the stronger levers or the better levers? Is it policy, or is it markets? Is it the social aspect? or again, is it that combination?
So I'm not sure I can give a solid answer to that, but it's a really good question, and I think that is an area where we need like lots of research, particularly as we're in many countries around the world where we're moving towards this reliance on, or hoping that we can develop these markets and these mechanisms to increase private sector investment in these areas, thinking about where that is going to be an effective approach, which it may well be in some cases if we design them effectively, but where also that's going to need, where different types of biodiversity will need public sector engagement to be the most effective route. And I think also recognizing, and this is again work from Sophos to WAMGAS, and recognizing that if we want to create these pathways for private sector engagement, particularly through market design, that needs the public sector to appropriately design and monitor and enforce those markets. They're often artificial markets that are created as a result of government legislation. So this sort of boundary between public and private action is actually a bit blurred sometimes. But it's a really good question. It's not a very good answer to it, but I think it's a really important area that needs a lot more thought.
I think you're absolutely right around that blurring of public and private, and whether it's not just let the market take care of it. It's setting up the regulatory frameworks that drive actions that enable market mechanisms in there. So another question that's come through, which I think springs off your paper on the bird strike risks with renewable energy infrastructure, and it's a very timely and pertinent question here in WA at the moment, with a real rapid increase in renewable energy infrastructure development, but also our resource sector expanding into supplying everybody else's renewable energy transition as well. So both the infrastructure development and the resource extraction for that infrastructure development. And the question is really around whether the tools exist to help answer the question of the balancing of the impact of that transition to renewables. So you had the climate impacts also having some biodiversity impacts, but then also you've got the infrastructure development and the integration of those two drivers, I suppose, of change.
Really good question, and really tricky as well. I think thinking about biodiversity impacts, there is an increasing amount of information available on the actions that we can take, particularly thinking about renewable energy, so wind power, power lines, solar power, etc., to avoid, minimize impacts and design them in a way that really does try and reduce those trade-offs. And I've seen now examples around the world of like really nice examples of maps of how you can best site these different types of projects so that they have they can still generate energy but minimize those sort of impacts. It might be collisions with birds, collisions with bats, etc. So I would say there's a lot of guidance out there that can guide more effective design, but it doesn't totally get the answer to your question, because you're never going to minimize impacts completely. And so that trade-off between different environmental and social goals is really tricky, and it depends on sort of societal values on how we're going to address these different crises. And we may well deem that some level of biodiversity impact may be necessary so that we can also transition to this more sustainable economy where we have less reliance on carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. Again, really, I'm not sure that's a good answer to your question, but that trade-off is a really tricky thing to answer, and I think sort of modeling approaches there are really useful to try and understand those trade-offs before we make decisions on what actions to take.
Yeah, and I think it's really valuable to note the positive trajectory in what can be planned into developments as we learn more around mitigating and avoiding impacts as we develop. I'm just going to do a little bit of clicking while I'm talking here to bring up a slide which allows me to remind everybody to take a couple of minutes at the end of the webinar to follow that QR code and give us some feedback on the content and things you'd like in future webinars, and remind everybody that WABSI's YouTube channel has recordings of the webinars available. There'll be a little bit of editing and topping and tailing to tidy this one up, and then it'll be there and accessible through the WABSI website. Also going to just take a moment to promote our upcoming publication on biodiversity, economics and finance. Ram Pandit has been leading a large piece of work for WABSI over the last 2 years, and that will be released in I was going to say coming days, but let me say coming weeks instead, as we finish the final edits and publish that before the end of the year. In closing, I thank Tom again for his presentation today and for the insights gained, and encourage everybody to check out our events page on the website for information about the 2026 webinars. We haven't set a date yet for the first one in the new year, but we'll let people get a bit of a Christmas and summer break under their belts and come back in the new year with a series of webinars coming up. Oops, leave that on the screen. And with that, thank you once again, Tom, and thanks everyone for your attendance and participation in today's webinar. Thanks.
Thanks very much.